After a week off, we are back on the Testudo Talk podcast. I'm Emmett Siegel. Andrew Chodes is here with me. Andrew, we're into the new year. We're into 2024. We got a lot to talk about this episode. Maryland football, we haven't talked to everyone since the Music City Bowl in Nashville, and then Maryland basketball's had a game or two since then as well. First off, how you doing? How you feeling energized, as we enter into the new year?
Yeah, I'm doing well. Excited for the new year. A lot of exciting stuff happening with Maryland sports, and looking forward to talking about it.
Yeah, well, let's do it. And we should probably start with the football game with the
Yeah,
bowl game against Auburn, Music City Bowl. Maryland comes out on top in pretty decisive fashion. 31-13 was the final score. In Nashville, we were there watching it, and it went. I don't think either of us were expecting necessarily the scoreline to be that big in favor of Maryland, but it was a pretty complete effort, at least early on from the team. The quarterbacks that we were talking about, the young quarterbacks, Billy Edwards and Cam Edge, both came out looking really strong. Maryland goes up 21-0. And then from there, not necessarily as efficient on offense, but Maryland's defense really took over, especially some of those young DBs looked really impressive and some other guys as well on that defensive front. So when you just look at the complete nature of that game, it's hard sometimes to take a little bit from bowl games just because it's an exhibition. Some guys aren't playing. You're rotating some guys in and out. You never know exactly what the motivation is going to be, but overall, how encouraging would you say it was to see Maryland come out on top in that decisive fashion?
yeah, and I think you said it. I don't think the game could have gone any better for Maryland, right? I mean, you score in your first three possessions, you go up 21-0. I thought both quarterbacks looked really good early. I think the how the game kind of slowed down in the end kind of dictated their play towards the end of the game. But I thought Cam Edge, I thought he looked really, really comfortable in the pocket, especially that deep throw to Caden Prather early was unbelievable. I think that showed some of his potential, but the defensive backs to me that was my biggest takeaway. I thought they were absolutely phenomenal. Um, Glenn Miller, Perry Fisher, both played really well. I know Jaquan Shepard. I know he's going to the NFL draft. He's out of eligibility, but he looked awesome as well. So I mean, credit to Brian Williams, right? I think that can be the main takeaway. The defense, they were really good at the beginning of the year, kind of slipped up midway through the year, and then they finished off really, really strong. And I think that's a testament to Brian Williams and his staff and kind of what they've implemented this season, kind of ending on a strong note, I think is always a positive thing for the culture of the team.
Yeah, and also Henry Baker, the cornerbacks coach, defensive
Yeah.
backs coach, done a really good job of developing some depth in that room. We talked about it a lot at the beginning of the season about what they lost last year with a couple guys going to the NFL. You're going to have something similar this year with Tarheeb Still. He didn't play in the game, although he was probably the best dressed player there. He really rocked the Nashville outfit with the cowboy hat, with the belt buckle and everything. I thought that was great. But you're losing Tarheeb Still. You're losing Jaquan Shepard to the draft. Bo
Mhm.
Braid's a safety, but he's gone as well. So you're going to need some of those younger guys in the secondary to step up next year. We got a little bit of a preview in Nashville of what maybe we'll see next year. It kind of gave me a reminder of maybe the Pinstripe Bowl. We talk about the running backs, the way that Roman Hemby and Antoine Littleton kind of broke out there, and they put together the last two pretty good years. Obviously, Littleton's in the portal, but Hemby's kind of been a very consistent back for this Maryland team in those 2 years. Really, really good at times as well. You mentioned Perry Fisher. You mentioned Jaquan Shepard and Glenn Miller. Those guys are really, really played well. Shepard, it was good to see a guy like that play in the game and help out his draft stock. Jacorian Bennett did that last year. He was going to the NFL, but he decided to play in the bowl game, and then he had an interception to win the game at the end. Jaquan Shepard didn't necessarily get the takeaway, but it was still a really, really good sight to see. And also Levain Scruggs as well, I believe, had an interception.
Yeah.
Dante Trader had interception, but there was a penalty on the play, so it didn't count. But overall, Maryland's DBs were all over the ball, and I thought
Mhm.
overall they were really, really impressive. And I thought just defensive performance, like you said, was really impressive all around. I'll flip to the offensive side of the ball. You talked about Cam Edge. I'll talk a little bit about Billy Edwards, who did win the MVP of the game. Generally they're just probably going to give the MVP to the starting quarterback of the winning team. But Billy Edwards was named MVP. Really good on the ground as always. His passing was inconsistent once again as always. We've kind of become accustomed to that a little bit with Billy, where the throwing isn't necessarily all the way there, but he's really, really mobile and great with his legs. And he looked comfortable out there, if nothing else. Put the ball in harm's way a couple times, but overall, pretty good performance. I was really encouraged by what I saw between him and Cam Edge. Then you got MJ Morris coming in, the NC State transfer. I think we're headed to an offseason that, we'll talk about Talia a little bit because we got some news about Talia as well. But with Talia gone, you have the first time in a couple years where you're really going to have a quarterback competition this offseason. And I thought it was kind of cool to see the early stages of that. And Loxley even acknowledged that after the game, just say, we have a quarterback competition. I got a lot to think about this offseason.
Yeah, no, I think when we came to the game, I know there was a lot of probably discussions around the media of this game might kind of give us a clue as to who's going to start next year. I don't think it necessarily showed that. What I think it showed is that for me, I think Billy Edwards is definitely going to have a role in the offense next year, not even if he's not named the starter. I think Cam Edge, I think he's going to put up really stiff competition. I think Loxley's going to have to think about starting him, even as a younger player. And MJ Morris, a really small sample size. He has a winning record in the games he played at NC State. So we'll see. I think it's going to be a really interesting competition. But I think for me, the takeaway from the quarterback play is I think Billy Edwards, just his prowess on the ground, I think is going to give Maryland. I mean, we saw he had what 6 touchdowns in a span of 3 quarters, something like that. I mean, to end the season, I believe he had 7 touchdowns in the last 3 games or 6. So I mean, just an absolutely he's so valuable on the ground. It kind of reminds me a little bit of like a Taysom Hill and the Saints. You
Yeah, I
gotta
mean, you could
throw him
probably
in.
find a creative way to use Billy.
Exactly. I mean, for sure. And I think just kind of wrap this up. I think there was just a lot of encouraging positive signs from the game. I don't think there were many negatives.
Yeah, I mean, from an Auburn perspective, obviously the game went the complete opposite way, and
Yeah.
they're kind of building as a program where Maryland is, even maybe a little bit farther ahead. Obviously, Auburn higher ceiling and all that, but Maryland's a little farther ahead in its build with Loxley as opposed to Auburn with Hugh Freeze. But when you look at Maryland, very, very encouraging. I don't think there was really anything in that game that I would be discouraged by personally. I thought Maryland outplayed Auburn on offense, defense, special teams. Auburn turned the ball over I think 4 times. I think they had 2 fumbles on punt returns as well. And Maryland special teams looked pretty solid. Like it was all overall just a pretty much a dominant performance from Maryland. And there was really no question after that first drive, to me at least, what was going to happen in that game. It was
Mhm.
fitting, like you said, that Billy Edwards gets the short yardage touchdown on the first drive.
Yeah.
But I will be interested to see, maybe they can work out a way and MJ Morris might kind of, put a little bit of a wrench in this. But I left that game thinking that there's definitely room for both Cam Edge and Billy Edwards in the offense next year.
Absolutely.
Cam Edge,
Absolutely.
his arm was really impressive. We talk about that one throw to Prather, which was a beautiful deep ball, which Talia wasn't the most accurate with. Billy, we've really yet to see him connect on one of those. And he'll even tell you that he said that after the game as well. Cam's got a really good arm, a really impressive arm, especially for someone as inexperienced as he is. I think you
Mhm.
could definitely find a way to get him in the game while keeping Billy's legs as a valuable asset for you. I don't know exactly how to
For
do
sure.
that. Josh Gaddis, Mike Loxley, they're gonna have to figure it out. And obviously MJ Morris is in the mix as well. And we haven't seen him in a Maryland uniform yet, but he could be a little bit of the best of both worlds. Maybe that's just, grass is greener. Who knows? But I'm definitely interested to see how that plays out. Now let's go a little bit big picture about the bowl win. This is the third straight year that Maryland's won a bowl game. That's the first time Maryland's ever done that. Won a bowl game in 3 straight seasons. They're 8-win season if you include the bowl game for the second straight year. When you look big picture at this season, it obviously ends on a positive note. So, now we're here after the game, a couple days after the game, looking at the season positively. But when you look at it from start to finish, what kind of stands out to you about this season and what will you take away from what you saw from Maryland football in 2023?
Very up and down. I think after the Northwestern game, I think there was tons of negativity around the program, a lot of questions if they would even make a bowl game. But I think the way they were able to kind of fight through that and end on a positive note with the 3 consecutive wins to end the season, I think that's really important for the culture and what they're trying to build. And I think you have to remember, right? It's just like before the pandemic, right? I mean, from 2015 to 2020, this program was in a really bad spot, and to put forth a couple winning seasons in a row in the Big Ten, which is only going to get more difficult, right? So I think to end on a positive note is really important. But I think you're all looking back on the season and you're going to look at it like a season of lost opportunity, right? You play 2 pretty good games against Michigan and Ohio State where you really had a chance of winning. And then, of course, the Illinois Northwestern game is unbelievably disappointing. But, a bowl win for the third straight year, first time in program history. You get 8 wins back to back years. So I think there's positives, right? And I think you kind of have to weigh that against the lost opportunities. But the end was strong, and we'll see if they can build that into next year.
Yeah, a lot of it's about how you finish. And obviously in college football, the regular season is a small sample size and, one game can kind of derail a lot of things. But I think overall, I would take away from this season that it felt like another step, even though the win total was the same, even though you didn't necessarily get that win, the signature victory, if we want to use that term, even though it's been kind
Mhm.
of overused, that maybe you've been looking for over the past couple of years. You still kind of look at it as a little bit more of that vision that Loxley set out coming to fruition, and you start to see a little bit of the growth, what you see in the bowl game, even though the bowl game at the end of the day isn't make or break for your season. Still to end the season with a win against Auburn, even though Auburn not a vintage Auburn team by any means, right? This Auburn team was not that great. Still to end with a win against a big name opponent in a decently sized stage, about as good as Maryland's done in terms of what bowl game they're playing in since, I don't know, the Orange Bowl, something like that. It's probably 1.5 steps below a game like that. To end a season like that, you gotta feel pretty positive about that. But what we talked about and what I take away from this is that you start to see the depth starting to be established for Maryland a little bit, and you start to see a little bit more confidence that when you lose a guy like Talia, maybe you're not going to take as big of a step back next year. When you lose some of these NFL DBs, maybe you have guys waiting in the wings for them. The tight ends, we didn't even talk about the tight ends. You're losing Corey Dyches,
Mm.
both Dylan Wade and Preston Howard catch a touchdown. It feels like
On the first two
Maryland's
possessions
at
too.
it feels like Maryland as a program is in a pretty healthy spot right now. Now, obviously, next year is going to
I agree.
be big with the quarterback questions and all that, but it feels like Maryland's in a pretty healthy spot. And I think when you look back, big picture on this season, it probably is dependent on what happens the next year or two, whether or not you look at this as a missed opportunity. But I think overall, when I look at it right now in this moment, I see it as just another building block towards maybe taking that next step, if that's even possible in this new Big Ten. I don't know, but I look at it at least big picture as somewhat of a positive. Before we talk, let's talk a little bit about Talia. But before we do that, is there anything you want to add?
I think we covered all.
Perfect. Well, let's talk about Talia because we got some news today that he's entering the transfer portal, or I guess has officially entered the transfer portal. We knew this was something that he was going to try to do because anybody that's looked at him as a draft prospect probably has come to the quick realization that his options aren't super ample in the draft process. He's not necessarily projecting to be an NFL quarterback, at least not a drafted NFL quarterback, and if he is, it's in the later rounds. So it makes sense for him to try and squeeze every bit of college eligibility he can out of this to try and get more NIL. I don't blame him at all for that. Obviously his time in Maryland is over, but maybe he'll seek it elsewhere. But when you look at this news, he's going to need a waiver from the NCAA because he is out of eligibility. He's used the red shirt. He's used the COVID year. Like he's out of eligibility. There's a chance he could get a waiver nowadays with the NCAA, the legal standing that they're on. I would expect that the NCAA. I just kind of expect them to lose any battle in court if they choose to go that way.
Yeah.
Both Maryland and Alabama would have to sign off on a waiver, which is still kind of unsure whether or not that's going to happen. I think Maryland filed the waiver, so maybe that means they signed off on it, but when you look at this, Miami comes up as an obvious destination. They're looking for a quarterback. That's where his brother plays professionally. But just first reaction to the Talia news when you saw it, did it take you by surprise at all? And what do you kind of think about it?
No, because I know there were definitely rumors kind of spiraling about it a little bit, and it makes sense for his career path, right? I mean, kind of his I think his legacy at Maryland was over, right? And I think that the program itself kind of decided to go in a different direction. You bring in MJ Morris and and for him, the opportunity is probably greater at a different program where he can kind of get more established on a national stage, get the NIL money. Because right now, like you mentioned, he's probably not gonna. He would be a late round draft pick possibly. Um, Personally, in my opinion, I think it's gonna be very difficult for him to be able to gain that extra year of eligibility. But the NCAA is super unpredictable. You really have no idea with the NCAA. Um, Definitely wish him the best, right? I think in his career where he ends up going, but I think it would be really weird to see him in a different jersey besides Maryland. Would definitely be an interesting sight for Maryland fans. But no, I can't say I was very surprised just because the rumors that were swirling about it in the past few weeks.
Yeah, I mean, I think when he opted out of the bowl game, it was
Yeah.
clear that his Maryland career was over. But then once again, he's not an elite draft prospect by any means in a year where there are a lot of really good quarterback prospects. So it's a little bit of probably bad luck and also just there are some limitations with size, with some of the stuff he's put on tape with the decision making. So it's not super surprising. I echo what you said that Maryland fans and us, as people that cover the team, should all wish him the best because what he did at Maryland, I know people are going to complain about some of the stuff he did, and maybe we'll see next year that it's a little bit of a system thing, but he definitely kind of helped elevate that program and did great things for Maryland. So I don't think there should be any ill will no matter where he goes. He's not going to like a Big Ten rival, right? That's not going to happen. Maryland's not going to sign off on the waiver for him to start the game next year against them. Like, if he's going anywhere, he's going somewhere with good NIL opportunities that's looking for a quarterback. And we'll just kind of wait and see what happens with that. I don't personally, like you said, expect it to really go anywhere, but maybe it does. Who knows? And if it does, then best to him and wish him the best of luck. With that being said, let's transition to some basketball talk. Um, I don't think you guys got the opportunity to talk about Coppin State game on the podcast since we last put one out. It's been a little bit. Obviously, this would be about 2 weeks since our last episode, but that game, kind of flush it, whatever. The biggest game that Maryland men's basketball played was against Purdue. Number one Purdue came to College Park, and it went unfortunately for Maryland about as you would expect. Purdue ended up winning by I think about 14, but they were up around 20 for most of the second half. It was pretty much just what you would expect from a team that's kind of trying to find its identity in Maryland versus Purdue, which might be, I think we both agree, we were talking before the call, that Purdue is probably the most complete team in the country right now. Probably if I had to make a pick to win the national championship, it would be Purdue right now. It once again, it went kind of as expected. Jameer Young kind of had to carry the scoring for Maryland as he's been doing. And you're just starting to see, more and more as we get farther along into the season, the hope kind of being sucked away of maybe some of these guys coming on later in the year. There's obviously still about 2 months in the regular season left, but from what we've seen so far, it was just a kind of another chapter in what's been an overall pretty frustrating season for Maryland. And now you don't have that home winning streak to write home about. It was 19 up to 19 games. When you look at the Purdue game, I was in the house. I know you had the opportunity to watch it on Peacock, which is a little bit unusual. What did you see from the game and just overall takeaways?
Uh, the shooting performance was really ugly. Julian Reese putting up 0 points and obviously struggling also against UCLA, I think is a ginormous concern. Really doesn't make much sense. We've seen how good he can be, but against some of these major conference teams, he's really struggled. Struggled against Villanova, struggled against UCLA, now struggles against Purdue. I think that's a massive concern for Maryland fans. Even Kevin Willard admitted it too. He's like, Juju needs to be better. He needs to adapt. But Jameer Young, he wasn't even at his best, and he carried the load for this team offensively. He scored 26 points, almost half of the team's points. But if the offense doesn't get going, and if guys not named Jameer Young continue to be just incapable of shooting the ball, essentially, it's going to be a long season, and I don't see this team getting many wins in the Big Ten unless something changes on the offensive side of the ball.
Yeah, well, one thing I pointed out in my takeaways article on testudotimes.com, once again, going to plug it, and you guys should go there for any, coverage you want of Maryland sports, not just football and basketball. We got it all on there. Was that, Maryland by losing at home, what you lose at home to number one Purdue, it knows what it is. Purdue beats amazing teams, right? You look at Purdue's resume, and they've beaten teams that are so much better than Maryland this year. But what that means is now if you want to replicate your record last year in the Big Ten, which got you, a middling seed in the NCAA tournament after a better non-conference schedule than you've put out. If you want to make the NCAA tournament, you're gonna have to start picking up wins on the road. And we know how difficult that's been for this team. This is coming out Saturday morning, Sunday afternoon, they have a game at Minnesota. We'll see what happens with that. See if they can snatch a win there. Minnesota has a decent record, not necessarily one of the strongest teams in the Big Ten, but has a decent record.
Poor strength of schedule.
Yeah, exactly. So it's the margin for error gets slimmer, after every game that goes by. And losing to Purdue, once again, is nothing to hang your heads about, but it's more so just the missed opportunities. And you start to look at the schedule, you start to look at the way the Big Ten's playing out, where maybe it's not as deep as we thought. Maybe it's kind of Purdue and everyone else. As we're recording this right now, Purdue is beating Illinois pretty handily. You're starting to look at the schedule and starting to notice, there's not too many opportunities for signature wins left. And when you're looking at an NCAA tournament resume that is going to include at least one quad four loss in Asheville, probably a couple quad three losses, some unconvincing wins against some weaker non-conference opponents, and then maybe a not so great Big Ten record. You start looking at the opportunities for this team, and I know Kevin Willard says, they're going to be better in February, but if they're better in February, it's too late. And he also said they were going to be better in December, and he said they were going to be better in January. At some point, this might just be what they are,
Yeah.
and what they are right now is definitely not a team that deserves to be playing in March.
I mean, this may sound crazy, but I think it's not. I don't think it's out of the picture to say their most realistic path to the NCAA tournament is to pull off a miracle run in the Big Ten tournament. I mean, it's crazy to say, but honestly, I don't think it's out of the realm of possibility. If Jameer Young has a like a cardiac Kemba type of march and just leads the team to like 15 straight victories, that
Yeah.
literally seems like the only right now, and a lot can change it from now to March, right? A lot can change, but right now it's looking ugly.
Yeah, and Jameer Young last year had to carry a lot of the load for this team. It's even more this year. Like you said, Julian Reese not even scoring against Purdue. That's the first time in his career that he played at least 15 minutes and didn't score. Last year against Purdue, he played really well. It was like last year against Purdue, the road game, which came before the home game where they were able to knock off Purdue when he went to the road to face Zach Edey, that was kind of the moment where you started to see it flip for him. You started to see him kind of come on, and you're like, okay, this is the Julian Reese that we were promised as a high school recruit that we've heard a lot about the development of. That was when you started to see it, and then he played really well against Purdue the next time around against Edey in that group as well. But then this time, Maryland just couldn't really do anything with
Right.
Edey and with Purdue's, ability to swing the ball around. That's what I want to kind of harp on. That was my biggest takeaway from being there in person. We got the opportunity to see Purdue in person last year, but that obviously did not go Purdue's way. This year, just seeing the contrast between what Maryland was doing on offense and what Purdue was doing on offense, just taking whether or not the shots were falling out of it, what the score was, just seeing the way that Purdue was had such a clear focus on offense. They were swinging the ball around inside out with Edey, kickouts for threes, driving to the rim. Obviously, it helps to have the National Player of the Year down low. I'm
There's
not
no
gonna,
rhythm. There's no rhythm in Maryland's offense.
exactly. Maryland would dribble, it was Young or whoever's the ball handler, brings across half court and then he's just kind of just waiting for some motion. Maybe he drops it off to someone, but then after that, there's not really any movement without the ball. There's not really any intent to get the ball to anyone in particular, get it in the post, swing it around, inside out for threes, whatever it was. It just looked like Purdue, I hate to say it, but Purdue just looked like a much better coach team. Just looks like a
Sure.
lot more motivated team
Hmm.
and their roster construction,
Hmm.
they were able to keep it around where they have that chemistry with each other. With Maryland, you're just seeing this just lack of rhythm and just this lack of fluidity where everything just looks really disjointed. And they did pretty well on defense to limit Purdue from I think it was the first time they scored under 70 points this year, or at least one of the first times. But even so, like it just when you've seen Maryland struggle this year. We've seen Maryland play against some decent teams and not play all too well. But
Yeah.
when you see the number one team in the country and the rightful number one team in the country come into Xfinity Center and just put on a clinic like that, it really just kind of opens your eyes to like how far Maryland is from being able to compete with teams like that. You don't necessarily have to beat Purdue to get to the NCAA tournament, but what you have to do is you have to beat teams that are competing with Purdue. And Maryland just didn't look like really it belonged on the same court as the Boilermakers, to be totally
It's
honest.
there's such a lack of enthusiasm right now around the program. Um, for being honest, which I think is really disappointing to see after what transpired last year. Um, I mean, if wins don't start to pile up from now, I would say until mid-February. If this team doesn't go at least 2 or 3 games over 500, I think there's going to be a lot of question marks surrounding the coaching staff if we're being realistic. I think just because of the expectations that were there this year. I mean, we've said this before, but the construction of the roster was not right. It was definitely underwhelming, and it's showing. And I'm just not, from what we've seen, I'm just not sure that Maryland's will be able to turn the season around just from what we've seen.
Yeah, and I think, once again, it's January 5th.
Yeah.
But, we're just putting this all out there now because it's, on the top of our minds. Like when you start looking at the direction of the program, And I know we had some of these talks about football team midway through the season, and then they kind of proved us wrong and kind of got back on track. But when you start looking at the direction of Maryland basketball, you start looking at the cupboard being somewhat bare for recruiting. I mean, they got Malachi Palmer, so they have a commit at least in the class for next year. But when you start looking at the recruiting that isn't necessarily at the level that it needs to be to give you enthusiasm after a season like this, it's just, yeah, like the questions do need to be asked. And if you start missing the NCAA tournament, I understand that like Mark Turgeon got like 10 years at Maryland. And I know a lot of people really didn't like Mark Turgeon, but Mark Turgeon got like 10 years at Maryland and he missed the NCAA tournament the first couple of times. But once you've proven, as Kevin Willard, you've proven last year that you can make the NCAA tournament,
Hmm.
you no longer get that leeway, right? And
Hmm.
and Kevin Willard inherited a much better program in a better state than Mark Turgeon did. If you miss the NCAA tournament as Maryland's head coach, I'm not going to say you have to be fired on the spot. I don't believe that. I don't believe you should just fire someone immediately after 2 years. When you look at the combination of that, the recruiting, if you miss the NCAA tournament as Maryland's head coach, like the questions need to be asked. You immediately need to be on the hot seat because Maryland, if you want to come into Maryland and call it a top 10 program, call it a top 10 job, talk about the expectations being for championships, and then miss the NCAA tournament, like that can't fly at a program like Maryland. And if Maryland wants to take itself seriously, it has to ask itself those
Yeah,
questions. And
you're
right now, it's definitely on a collision course with not only missing the NCAA tournament, and this team doesn't belong to be in the NIT right now.
it's crazy. It's really crazy you say that, but you're not wrong. And that's you're not wrong.
Yeah, and we'll revisit this, a lot of times throughout the season, and maybe they'll once again we with the football team. I remember, after the Illinois game, after the Northwestern loss, us being on this podcast talking about, do the questions need to be asked about if the program's trending in the right direction, and then you end the season with a couple wins and a close loss to a team that's playing for the national championship, and then all of a sudden you look at it and say, okay, they just had a couple hiccups. But Maryland, I mean, can you point to a game this year where you're like they really played well? Like I understand there were a couple against some really bad opponents, but like the UCLA win was a pretty ugly win. I mean, Jameer Young really carried them, and then they kind of faltered at the end.
I can't.
There hasn't really been a performance this year that really inspires confidence. I mean, even last year's team, this year's team, we shouldn't keep comparing them because at some point you just have to,
We're different
remember
teams.
this is
Yeah,
this year's team and it's
obviously.
already in January. But like last year's team, you could look at it and say, they dropped a couple games here, but and they played really bad, against this team. They got blown out by UCLA. They had a terrible offensive performance against Tennessee. Then you look back and you're like, well, they blew out Miami, who's good. They blew out St. Louis, who's good. They beat Illinois. Like Maryland this year has not had that kind of game. And the game like Purdue, I'll say it again. I've said it probably 5 times already. It's not that you lost to Purdue. It's that you lost another opportunity of the few remaining to really
Hmm.
bolster your resume. And at the end of the season, Maryland's going to have to play the resume game. I don't care if they go on a win streak. There's no
Exactly.
way, unless they win out, there's no way that they can play themselves into a lock into the NCAA tournament. They're going to be on the bubble, best case scenario. And when you start
Yep.
looking at the lack of, wins, we know the committee loves those. And, there's not really going to be any on the schedule. There's really no games
Mhm.
left. Maybe Michigan State if they end the season well, but like there's not really any games that I look at on the schedule as like opportunities for like a season defining victory that can really put you over the edge.
No, I wasn't trying to be funny when I said legitimately their best path right now might be a miracle run in the Big Ten tournament.
Yeah, and if Jameer Young has to keep doing this, he's not going to have anything left, for the Big Ten
Yeah.
tournament. But that's my rant on Maryland basketball. On January 5th, with about 2 months left before
Yeah.
the Big Ten tournament, approximately, and hopefully from a Maryland perspective, it doesn't age well, but I haven't seen anything to really make me think otherwise. Anything else you want to talk about before we get out of here?
I think you got it. I mean, I think Maryland football ended on a good note, and Maryland basketball is going the wrong direction.
Yeah, and we'll see how it all plays out, and we'll be here more frequently on the Testudo Talk podcast. We missed a week. We're fresh now into the new year, and we're ready to hit it hard for the rest of basketball season, and then for a little bit of the off season as well. So thanks everyone for listening. We will see you next week with another episode, and yeah, we'll see how the basketball team does between now and then, and if any football news comes our way, we will keep you all updated. Make sure to check us out at testudotimes.com as well. And thanks everyone for listening.